The economic crisis experienced during the late period of the Roman Empire is considered one of the most significant examples of fiscal crisis that states have faced throughout history. The processes that negatively affected the Roman economy during this period bear an almost identical resemblance to problems experienced today, such as inflation, budget deficits, tax burden, production decline, labor loss, debt, and currency devaluation. Rome's vast territories, invincible army, and centuries-long dominance did not actually mean its economic foundations were solid. As the empire grew, its expenses increased, production resources were strained, and internal balances began to deteriorate. These disruptions gradually transformed into fiscal crises, slowly bringing Rome to the point of collapse. One of the most critical aspects of this process was Rome's military expenditures spiraling out of control. As Rome expanded, it had to feed more soldiers, secure its borders, and pay the legions. Normally, successful conquests continuously brought plunder and tax revenues to the empire, making it easy to finance the army. However, by the end of the 2nd century AD, the new large territories Rome could expand into had significantly decreased. Conquest revenues stopped, but expenses continued to rise. This corresponds to today's economic income-expenditure imbalance. Rome now had continuously increasing state expenses, but its revenues remained stagnant and in some periods dropped significantly. To solve this imbalance, emperors resorted to different methods. One of the first methods they turned to was debasing the currency. Rome's silver coin, called the denarius, had formed the economic foundation of the empire for centuries. However, when state revenues severely decreased, emperors tried to pay the salaries of citizens and soldiers with newly minted money. In doing so, they reduced the actual silver content in the coins with each iteration. For example, in the 1st century AD, a denarius was almost entirely silver. By the 3rd century AD, the silver content in the denarius had fallen below even 5%. This is historical evidence of inflation that occurs when central banks print unbacked money in modern times. When people in Rome realized the money was no longer as valuable as before, prices began to rise rapidly. This process is called Roman inflation by historians and is a vivid example of today's concept of inflation. As inflation rose, people's purchasing power rapidly eroded. Peasants, artisans, and urban citizens had to pay many times more for the same products than they had paid a few years ago. This situation created uncertainty in the economy and caused trade to stagnate. Many merchants switched to bartering goods instead of using the devalued currency. The state began having difficulty collecting taxes because the currency in people's hands was no longer valuable. This imbalance in the Roman economy closely resembles the tax collection difficulties and shaken market confidence seen during high inflation periods today. As Rome's economic crisis deepened, production began to decline at the same rate. Wars and internal conflicts led to agricultural fields being abandoned. The decline in production made it difficult for people to access basic necessities and pushed prices even higher. Additionally, Rome's economic structure was largely based on slave labor. Most slaves were obtained from wars and brought from conquered territories. However, when Roman conquest slowed, the flow of new slaves came to a halt. This situation led to increased labor costs throughout the empire. Now, paid workers were needed instead of cheap slave labor, which increased production costs. The wheels of the Roman economy began to turn increasingly expensive and inefficient. Instead of solving this economic deadlock, the state preferred to impose new taxes. As taxes increased, pressure on peasants and small producers grew. Many people abandoned their land because they couldn't pay taxes or entered under the protection of large landowners. This process led to the formation of an early prototype of the feudal system in Rome. Due to economic hardships, people's loyalty to the state decreased and central authority became excessively weakened. The crisis of the 3rd century in the mid-3rd century AD was the period when the economic crisis was most intensely felt. During this period, approximately 30 emperors changed within a few years in Rome. Continuous civil wars, political instability, and economic collapse became a vicious cycle feeding each other. The currency became almost completely worthless. People no longer trusted the money minted by the state. At this point, Emperor Diocletian intervened and took harsh measures to restore economic order. Among the most famous was price controls. Diocletian issued a decision known as the Edict on Maximum Prices, fixing the prices of hundreds of products through state intervention. The aim was to stop inflation, but the result was the opposite. Producers didn't want to sell goods at the low prices set by the state. Many producers withdrew their goods from the market, and a black market emerged. This serves as a very old lesson on how state-controlled price policies can distort markets when incorrectly applied. Rome's economic collapse was not limited to fiscal indicators alone. Military power was also affected by this collapse. When the army's salaries lost value due to inflation, soldiers became dissatisfied. The state had to spend more money to recruit new soldiers. At the same time, pressure from barbarian tribes increased. Economically weakened, Rome struggled to provide the military force to resist these pressures. Thus, economic collapse triggered military weakness, which led to the empire becoming defenseless against external threats. In conclusion, the economic collapse of the Roman Empire is one of the most powerful historical examples of how a state economy can slowly erode through wrong monetary policies, excessive spending, increasing taxes, declining production, diminishing confidence, rising inflation, and political instability. The vast majority of economic crises experienced by states in the modern world share similar dynamics with Rome's legendary collapse story. Rome's experiences give us the most fundamental economic lesson. A state's power comes not just from its army or the size of its territories, but from the sustainability of its economy. When the economy deteriorates, the entire structure of society begins to break down. This reveals how even one of history's greatest empires collapsed when its economic foundations weakened.